The following is a copy of a tape recording, a talk made by Marty M at the Tudor Group in New York City in December of 1952. As you know, Marty is the author of the primer on alcoholism. She is also on the National Committee on Alcoholism.
So I'm going to give you that charming woman, Marty M.
It's not very nice to start out by contradicting your introducer, because Charlie gave me a very nice introduction. But I hope I never live to see the day when I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because from the way I look at it, that would mean that I was drunk. You see, I don't think it's possible to resign from Alcoholics Anonymous, nor do I think it's possible to graduate from Alcoholics Anonymous. I think that when you come in to AA, you come in for life. At least that's what you hope. And I am more inclined to agree with Jim that you don't know whether you've made it or not until you leave this life. Even those who fall by the wayside, as Jim did, don't necessarily resign from AA or leave AA during their fall. We don't feel they have, and most of us who have had to deal with people who have had relapses or slips, as we call them, have never ruled them out of membership. We have merely felt that they've drifted a little away for a while and that they'll come back. That's always my feeling about anyone who has once been bitten with this bug. Because I also agree with what Charlie said earlier, that if you once get it in your system, if it once comes to mean anything to you at all, you never again will be happy without it. And if you deliberately turn your back on it for a while, or if that back turning occurs through no conscious, deliberate act of yours, but seems to happen to you, I think it is true that you suffer an unusual amount, to put it mildly. I think it is far worse to return to drinking after you have been in AA than it would have been had you gone on without that interlude. You see, AA does something to us, all of us. It does something even to those who come in to observe, who stay around for a while still feeling that they're on the outside looking in, and who perhaps decide that they don't belong here yet and go away and continue what has been their kind of living and thinking up to that point. They may not know it, but a little bit of AA has rubbed off on them. I've seen this too often. I've heard it expressed later by too many people, that they couldn't come in contact with AA. They couldn't even be a nominal part of it for a while without its affecting them very deeply. It's as if a little seed were planted, a little seed that they may have overlooked, not recognized. And yet, while they seemingly went on in their old way of living and thinking, that little seed was germinating, was sprouting. And after a while, it grew big enough and strong enough to push them back in. I think possibly that I ought to begin with some small identification of myself as having a right to stand up here. Like the other speakers, I am an alcoholic. I came into AA a good many years ago. And I feel, too, that it's often hard to tell, just from looking at someone, that they really are an alcoholic, particularly if they've been away from drinking over a period of years. But in my case, I would like to tell all you that I wasn't a panty-waist drinker. I wasn't what we call in AA a high-bottom drunk. I was an alcoholic that went all the way. And I can agree with Jim, too. I don't think I was ever a social drinker. I feel that I was an alcoholic from the first drink I took. I didn't get into any trouble with it for the first 10 years. There may have been many reasons for that. I rather think it was because I was young and strong, and I could throw off the effects of the kind of drinking I did, because I don't think it was ever normal drinking. I always drank more than anyone else I knew. I always went on drinking longer than anyone else I knew. I just didn't have bad results from it. I could take it. And this happy state of affairs, at least I thought it was happy at the time, I was awfully proud of it, went on for about 10 years. In the light of the knowledge I have today, I know that's an average time. That in most cases, it takes 10 years of drinking before alcoholism begins to show visibly, so that other people can see it as well as yourself. I also know today that there is knowledge available, so that if you had it, you would be able to recognize from the outset that your drinking wasn't like other people, that your drinking wasn't normal social drinking. But those symptoms that I speak of are not usually visible outside yourself. They are things which you could recognize if you knew them, but which don't necessarily show. And so they don't mess up your life, and they don't get you into trouble, and they don't cause you any particular concern. I think that was my case. But at the end of 10 years, a change came about. It was gradual. It didn't happen suddenly overnight like a thunderclap. But one after another, the visible symptoms began to show. The blackouts. I had those badly, too. They didn't begin badly. They began being short, and always I could attribute them to something else. Either that I hadn't eaten, or I was terribly tired, or I had had a fall, which I had had, and I laid it all to a concussion for quite a long time. But as time went on, they increased in their severity, in the length of time they lasted, and by the last summer of my drinking, they lasted sometimes for days. And there were other things, too. I developed visible signs of drunkenness. It was obvious to people when I was drunk. I developed rubber legs. My behavior became very questionable, not only to other people, but more important to me. I lost control of my tongue. It was hung in the middle and wagged at both ends. And it often gave forth with things I wished it hadn't when they came back to me later. In other words, I had all the signs and symptoms of alcoholism in full flower. And to me, one of the most important ones was the physical condition that it put me in. I was desperately sick most of the time. I felt horrible. It took a great deal of liquor to make me feel normal. And by the time I reached that happy state of affairs, I was already sliding down the other side where I felt drunk. That lovely little pinnacle of feeling normal and like other people became a vanishing point. I couldn't find it. I either felt horrible or I felt drunk. I wasn't one of those that particularly liked the sensation of being drunk. I never had liked it. That wasn't what I was looking for. I suppose I liked the oblivion that came at the end of it. I never knew whether I did or not, because I never knew it was coming, and I certainly didn't know it when I was in it. And afterwards, it was no more than if I'd been asleep. So I don't know how it is that people know that they like oblivion. I never knew it. I know there was one thing I did like. I liked to feel well. I liked to feel comfortable. I liked to feel at ease. I liked to feel like other people. And this was something I couldn't manage. That's a pretty terrible thing. I can remember on many occasions getting in a bus or a subway or even walking down the street and looking at all the people that were walking by and thinking to myself, have you any idea how lucky you are? You look as if you felt well. You feel like human beings. Why can't I feel that way? I'd wonder how they really felt inside, if they felt as well as they looked. It's an extraordinary thing to want something so desperately that most people have without ever giving it a second thought, just to feel ordinary, just to feel normal, just to feel moderately well. I didn't want to feel in the pink like this, pounding my chest and taking exercises. No, I just wanted to feel moderately well, as most people seem to do all the time. And this desperate desire was denied me. The last 5 years of my drinking, I was in a condition constantly where I had to have a considerable quantity of alcohol before I could get out of bed, before I could stand on my legs and wash my face and comb my hair. And then I had to keep on having it at very brief intervals in order to stay in that condition. And if I ran out of liquor and was without it for an hour, I sank back to where I had been, unable to function, with my hands shaking so they were about to fly off my arms. That last 5 years of my drinking wasn't any fun. There wasn't an instant of fun in it. I had had fun the first 10 years I drank before I had to pay for it. I'd had a good deal of fun. But that left. And that had been gone a very long time before I found any help. I began looking for help very shortly after the thing changed. I don't think I'm very different from other people. When our pleasure is superseded by our pain, we look for a way to get rid of the pain. Nobody wants to be in pain all the time. And by that time, I was in pain in every direction that I could look. I was in physical pain a good deal of the time. The kind of hangovers I had at that period, and they lasted even after I'd been drinking for a few hours, it took that long to get out of them, were agonizing. Physically, I was very sick. I was in terrible mental pain because I knew what was happening to me. When you're in the condition I was in, you don't function very well as a human being. You aren't awfully popular with other people. They don't want this human wreck around. And so mentally I suffered because I could see what was happening, what I was losing, what I had lost, what a desperate, barren outlook lay ahead. And of course I suffered emotionally. I had lost first my friends, the love of people I cared about, and those who still cared I was desperately hurting. and I didn't like that. No one likes to think they're the cause of other people's suffering. And so I suffered deeply, emotionally. I suffered terribly in my career because I no longer could work. The last few years that I worked, it was moving from place to place, from job to job, unable to function properly for very long at a time. And that meant that I suffered financially, because in my particular case, if I didn't work, I couldn't live. I began to live on borrowing, on friends' bounty, as long as they remained friends. There was no department in which I wasn't suffering that entire 5 years. And the suffering increased as the years grew in number, because alcoholism is progressive, and each year it was a little worse than it had been the year before. So it's quite natural, I think, that I began looking for a way out. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I'd never heard the word alcoholism, and if I'd heard it, I wouldn't have known what it meant, or what it was, or what to do about it. I just knew something was desperately wrong. I came to an obvious conclusion. I thought it was mentally wrong. First, I thought it was a breakdown. Later, I was convinced that it was a serious insanity. I wasn't one of those that feared insanity might lie at the end of my road. I was convinced I had it right now. And that isn't a very happy thing to live with. I sought help before I came to that conclusion. Doctors spoke of nervous breakdowns. They told me to go away. They told me to change my way of living. I did those things. Long since I had begun my moving from group to group. That happens to a good many of us, because we resent when people try to say something to us about the way we drink. I don't think it's so terrible a sign against us that we resent that. I know one reason I resented it. I was trying desperately myself to control this thing. It never occurred to me to try anything else. Control was what I was after. I was constantly trying to control it. I was constantly making promises to myself. I never made them to anyone else. I made them to myself, and I meant them. And I couldn't keep them. This was what frightened me so. So when other people began to talk to me, they were talking after the fact. They were telling me something that had been keeping me awake nights, that I'd been worried about long before they thought of it. And I resented their poking in, and also they set up that fear all over again. In my recognition that this that they were suggesting was what I couldn't do, that I couldn't control my drinking. I didn't seem to know how. It frightened me doubly because it was the first thing I'd ever run into that I hadn't been able to manage. It was the first thing that I'd ever attempted that I couldn't do by will and determination. I'd run my life on will and determination, and here it was failing me. I didn't find any help. I didn't find any help for 5 years. At the end of that time, I found a doctor who said he thought he could help me, and I went into a hospital. And I remained there for a good many months. And then I was shifted to a sanitarium where I got what I had been looking for all that time, which was psychiatric treatment. I was convinced that that was what I needed for this insanity of mine, this mental crack-up. I wanted this help. I was the one who had found it for myself. No one had thrust it upon me. I'd spent 5 years trying to get it. It wasn't easy for me because I was broke. I couldn't just go out and buy it. I couldn't just walk into a doctor's office and say, I'd like to be your patient, and I want to see you every day, and send me the bills at the end of the month. It was hard for me to find it. That's why it took so long. And when I found it, it was a gift of great value to me. And so I cooperated, as the word goes, with all my heart and with all my mind. There was another point about this that I think was important. I had tried every way I knew to manage whatever it was that was wrong with me, and I had failed utterly and completely, and I had no hope anymore that I could succeed alone. And so when I received what I had sought so long and so hard, I knew it was my last chance. That was the way I looked at it. I wanted it to work. I wanted to get well. I wanted desperately to feel like other people. I wanted to feel well in the daytime. I wanted many other things, but that is a very basic thing that many of us understand who have been in the grip of alcoholism for any length of time. You would think with all of that desire, and with the fact that it was deep and honest and true, that I would have had no trouble, that I would have sailed through and come out the other side and been well as I wanted to be. And also I must add to this that I was in an institution. I wasn't under the temptation of living in the city, of passing bars every day wherever I went, of being with people who were drinking. No, I was in a sanitarium. It's true we had freedom in this institution. We weren't locked up behind bars. And I was allowed, when I needed to or wanted to come into New York, to go to the dentist, or perhaps to shop, or even to go to a theater with a friend. And sometimes to stay overnight or to go away for the weekend. And 9 times I would do this, and it would be all right. And the 10th time, I would get drunk. Now, to me, this was beyond understanding. This wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't understand compulsion. I didn't know there was another term for alcoholic, and that term was compulsive drinker. I didn't know all of the things that could set that compulsion in motion. And yet I was improving. I had learned a tremendous amount under treatment. I was learning all the time. And I think I was growing as a person. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to keep me from drinking every now and then. And I was throwing away my last chance. And I knew this. But I couldn't seem to help it. It was at that point, fortunately for me, and I never feel the word fortunately is a strong enough word, because it was life or death for me. It was have a future or have none. It was be a person, a human being like other human beings, or be something less than human, a mindless hulk or wreck. My doctor got a copy of a manuscript which was about to be published as a book. He was deeply impressed with this manuscript, and he gave it to me to read. The title was Alcoholics Anonymous. He told me that it was the story of 100 people who had recovered from alcoholism. That alcoholism was my trouble. And that maybe this would help me, because he was beginning to wonder if he could. In fact, I think he was desperate about helping me at that point, and certainly I was desperate about myself. And so I began to read this book. I read it with my hopes high. and I found in it immediately a few things that sent my hopes still higher. For one thing, I learned I had something very specific wrong with me, and it wasn't the insanity that I had feared. All of the doctors who had treated me, and there had been several by then, had tried to convince me that I wasn't insane. They hadn't succeeded. Deep in my heart, I thought they were glossing it over. I thought they were trying to make it easier for me. I still believed it. But here in this book I saw that there were many people like me. They weren't exactly insane. They had a disease called alcoholism. They shared this disease. It was alike in all of them. It made them behave in the same way. It made them feel the same inside. It did the same things to them. I recognized myself there. I wasn't alone. I wasn't a freak. I didn't have something nameless wrong with me that no one dared say out loud. The word alcoholic and the word alcoholism were welcome words to me. I had no problem accepting them. They didn't frighten me or bother me. They were so much better than what I really thought was wrong that I was only too happy to accept them. And then I went on in this book and my heart sank. It said that this program by which they had got well was a spiritual program. They said it depended on God, or a higher power, if you like. I didn't like either word. They said you had to believe and have faith. I didn't believe. I had no faith. And furthermore, I didn't want any. I had been fighting that for a good many years. I didn't want that way out. I had an intellectual arrogance and pride about it. I felt that was a weak way out, that was an emotional way out. I wanted to do it myself, all alone. Wouldn't you have thought I might have guessed that was a little egotistic? Just a little? I didn't see it that way. And so I felt this couldn't be for me, and I turned my back, figuratively speaking, on the book. I wasn't allowed to turn my back on it. My doctor insisted that I go on reading, and I went on reading. I read a bit every day, and then I went down and argued with him about it. It was wonderful. I loved to argue, and it was the best grist I'd had to my mill for a long time. Also, it took the spotlight off me for a little while, and that was a relief, too. We could argue about the book now instead of about me. This went on for weeks. I don't know how long it might have gone on had I not had another fortunate accident, because a crisis occurred in my life affecting someone whom I loved very much, a close relative. A crisis in which I felt I had played a key role, that if I hadn't been where I was, and if I hadn't been what I was, this wouldn't have happened. There was nothing I could do about it. I was utterly helpless. And in my helplessness, I was very angry. And in my anger, what do you suppose happened? I told you I'm an alcoholic. I wanted to go out and get 2 bottles and drink them both at once and bust up the joint. Isn't it a curious thing about an alcoholic that when something happens that they want to change and they can't, they then want to hurt themselves? I think that's very curious, because really what I wanted right then was to get a good big hammer and beat myself over the head until I was senseless. That's what getting a bottle or 2 and drinking it would have done to me. And that was what I wanted. While I was in this state of mind, I was lying on a bed in my room, and this manuscript was lying there, and I had knocked it open, and it fell open to a page that I glanced at. I couldn't read the page, it all looked blurred. But right in the middle of it, there was a phrase that stood up as if it were raised, black and sharp and clear. And that sentence said, "We cannot live with anger." I knew that was true. That I could accept. And just because I suppose I could accept that one little line, I suddenly was able to accept more. Because in that instant, the barriers and the resistances that I had put up against believing, against accepting a power greater than myself, dissolved. And I believed. It was an extraordinary moment. It frightened me to death. It frightened me so much that I rushed to tell the doctor that now I really had gone insane. He told me I hadn't, that I'd better hang on to what I'd got. You know, I started reading that book again, that book that I had taken such intense pleasure in tearing to pieces, that it provided me with such luscious material for argument. And it was a quite different book. It wasn't the same book at all. Oh, it was on the same pages and between the same covers, but to me it was unrecognizable. It's a little like what Jim said earlier. Nothing had changed except my attitude. But reading this book with a new attitude was reading a new book, a totally different book. And this time, I sopped it up like a sponge. I accepted everything in that book. And I began to think deeply about the 12 steps that I found there, and the suggestions and instructions as to how to use them. The next step, of course, for me was to go to a meeting, to meet some of these people. And that I was reluctant to do. I think I was afraid of it. I went in another month, and I found there, far from anything to fear, I found welcome. I found friendship. I found understanding. I found a spirit of love abroad, love in the greatest sense. I was made to feel that I belonged, and I did belong. And so I began my career in AA. I tell you this background for several reasons, but one very important one was to make you see that I had good reason to have an honest desire to stop drinking, when I knew that that was the only answer, when I could accept that that was the only answer. It's a curious thing that for a year and a half the doctors had been telling me I could never drink again. I couldn't accept it from them. Somehow I was able to accept it from the AA book and from the people I met in AA. I was able to accept it and therefore to use it. You can't use anything until you've accepted it. And acceptance, I must add, is not something that you do just on the top of your head. A real acceptance is an acceptance of the heart and the emotions. It's an acceptance in your bones and your blood and your nervous system. It's an acceptance with all of it. And that's the only kind of acceptance that'll do you any good at all. It's the only kind of acceptance that you can really use. And the curious thing was that once I accepted that, the basic premise of AA, then I think I accepted the whole thing. Because all of it came trooping in after that, so that there was practically no difference. And with my acceptance, I was able to make progress. All this time I was convinced that I was in AA for one purpose and one purpose only: to learn how to stop drinking and stay stopped. And another word for that is sobriety. It's interesting to me that Charlie made a distinction about sobriety as we usually use it here, and its true and very much bigger and broader meaning. But I'm going to continue using it for the moment as it is usually used here. Sobriety means to most of us in AA not drinking. I think it would be well if we recognized that it meant a great deal more than that. But I'm going to put my difference in a different way. I came in looking for a way to stop drinking and to stay stopped. Furthermore, I wanted to be comfortable in not drinking, because I didn't think it was much use, and I still don't, if you stop drinking and hate every minute of it. You might just as well go back to drinking. What's the use of sobriety if you hate it? What's the use of it if it makes you uncomfortable? If it makes you unhappy? I don't quite see how a person who has suffered from their drinking can feel that way about it. Because if you get nothing else out of not drinking, you at least get a cessation of that suffering. And that's something. Nevertheless, I know that there are some people who get sober and stay sober quite a while and who really don't enjoy it, who wish that they weren't sober. Now, for such people, I would say they'd either better go back to drinking and give up the whole business and reconcile themselves to the fact and accept, in the way I mentioned, the two alternatives of insanity or premature and painful death, and once having accepted that, say, that's what I want and that's what I'm going out for, and this is the way I'm going to get it, because we know this is an inevitable and sure way of getting it. Or else, they had better find out why they can't be comfortable or happy or interested or feel alive sober, because there's something terribly wrong. Sobriety is the natural state of human beings. Drunkenness isn't. And if we can't feel right in the natural state of a human being, then what are we? No, I think this brings up many questions. For me, I wanted both things. I wanted sobriety, and I wanted to feel comfortable, and I wanted to be able to enjoy life. And for me, AA offered the chance of just that. The people that I saw here seemed to me to be enjoying it. They looked as if they were. They acted as if they were. They didn't seem unhappy about being sober. So I figured this was right for me. And this was the place I would come to get my sobriety and to keep it. And that was all I thought about. That was the reason I came into AA. That was what AA meant to me. And for several years, that was what AA gave me. But then something began to happen. That thing that you heard both speakers mention. Your attitudes begin to change, and they don't stop changing. You begin to grow, and you don't stop growing. Many of us know that we stopped growing in one part of ourselves, emotionally or spiritually or both, at some period during or just before our bad drinking. And that one of the things that happens when we get sober is that we have to catch up. We have to make up that growth period that we lost. And sometimes, because of that gap, when we first get sober in AA, we do a shoot up. We seem to grow a lot very fast. That's partly what that honeymoon feeling is. But it doesn't go on at that rate. It couldn't very well. It flattens out. And for many of us, there's then a rather dull period when we don't seem to be going very far or moving very fast or getting anywhere. And we can't take that. You know, one of the characteristics of alcoholics is that they have a very low tolerance to frustration. They just can't take it. And that's another thing we have to learn. We have to come up eventually with the same kind of tolerance for frustration that the rest of the world has if we're going to live in the middle of the world and with the rest of them. We can't set ourselves off as special and insist that just because we're alcoholics, we can't be frustrated. No, I think we've got to learn what to do about it and a little patience about it. Many things like that became apparent to me as I grew, and my attitude toward AA began to change. It no longer seemed to me just a way of getting sober and staying sober. It began to seem something quite different from that. It began to seem a way in which perhaps I could cope with this low tolerance for frustration, for instance. A way in which I could cope with many other of my daily problems in meeting life, in meeting other people, in being with people, in getting along with myself and with them, with the world in which I live. And looking closely at those 12 steps, I began to see that that's what they were all about. I saw for the first time, I noticed for the first time after I'd been in AA a number of years, that the word alcohol was only mentioned once in the 12 steps. In the first one. To admit that you are powerless over alcohol and that your life has become unmanageable is the only mention in the 12 steps of the word alcohol. The word alcoholism is never mentioned. That admission is the starting point. That admission and that acceptance that I spoke of earlier is the necessary basis on which you must build your approach to AA, your use of AA, your following of those steps. It suddenly occurred to me that I'd come into AA under false pretenses. I'd been got in under false pretenses. I had come to a place that had to do with drinking, to show me how not to drink. And I found that I'd arrived somewhere and was using, or thinking I was using, a program that didn't have a thing in the world to do with drinking. Nothing at all. Except this, that I knew perfectly well if I were drinking, I couldn't conceivably follow even one step of that program. I defy any alcoholic to honestly follow one of the 12 steps while drinking. It can't be done. You have to get sober in order to follow the 12 steps. You have to stay sober if you're going to work on them. You can't work on them drunk. Who knows better than we the distortion of the mind that drinking creates within us? Do we think straight when we're drinking? Do we even talk straight? Not alcoholics. Normal drinkers may be able to, but we can't. Drinking twists our thinking. It distorts it. Alcoholic thinking is a phrase we hear around here all the time. Do you suppose that we can approach those 12 steps with any idea of what they mean, or can make even the tiniest effort to comprehend and follow them with twisted up minds? Minds distorted by alcohol. We know we can't. So what it means then is that AA is not just a means of getting sober and staying sober. AA is a way of life. It is a design for living, if you look at it as the 12 steps, which are the heart and core of AA. Those 12 steps are difficult. They're simple, but they're not easy. They're difficult, they are profound, they would repay a good lifetime of study. And incidentally, as you grow, they look different to you. They mean more. They have broader implications, and they probe more deeply. But those steps have to do with you and me as individuals. They help us to look honestly and deeply within ourselves, to see what are our character defects. They help us to become willing to give up those character defects. They show us how to live with ourselves and with other people. In themselves, if we had developed nothing else, I often wonder how many of us could have stayed sober with just those steps. Because, you see, AA has developed a great deal else. The steps are the heart and the core. But I don't think the steps are what keep most new people sober in AA. I think what keeps most new people sober long enough to grasp the steps and begin to use them are the techniques that we've developed in AA, and these are something different. We have a great many of them. This is one, the meeting. The open meeting is one kind of technique, and the closed meeting is another kind of technique. And the sponsorship system is another kind of technique. And the fact that we urge newcomers to get to know somebody in AA is another. And that we also urge newcomers to get an address book and put down names and telephone numbers and addresses. And the fact that we urge them, if they feel like taking a drink, to call someone in their little book first and talk to them. And the fact that we have made this a place in which we can develop new social contacts. That AAs see a great deal of each other, particularly when they're first in, outside of meeting dates. They do things together. They can be with other people socially who are doing what they're doing, not drinking and trying not to drink. All of these things that we offer are techniques. They are ways and means of staying sober long enough to begin to grasp the 12 steps. And I think one of the most important techniques that we offer is what we call the 24-hour plan. That's a very important thing. It's one of the basic things in AA, but it is not mentioned in the 12 steps. It's a technique. It's first a technique for staying sober, day by day. Something that any of us can do. And later it becomes a technique of meeting some of the serious problems of life that we have to face usually in our early days of sobriety, the problems that have accumulated and grown up during our years of drinking. And so it is extremely valuable, and it's very basic, but it's a technique. It's not part of the 12 steps. By means of our techniques, then, I believe, we get sober, and we stay sober long enough to adopt the program of AA. But when we adopt that, then we're on another road. Then we are indeed dealing with sobriety in the terms that Charlie gave. Sobriety in its broadest sense. Sobriety that means the kind of a person you are. What you make of your life, what you do with your life. And this is why it is never ending. This is why you cannot resign from AA, nor can you graduate from AA, because this is dealing with you as a human being, with you as a soul, with you as a spirit. It's in the 12 steps that we find our spiritual bearings. It's in the 12 steps that we find a faith for ourselves, by whatever name we choose to call it. It's within the 12 steps that we begin to learn to make that faith works for us. Somebody doesn't like faith any better than I did when I came in. Well, that's probably true, too. But I suspect the point is faith. And I don't blame anybody that feels that way. I think it's a very natural reaction to those of us who first come in here. I think it's a reaction that those of us who have overcome that difficulty and that hump should be very tolerant with in other people. I don't think faith comes easily. I don't think it necessarily comes all at once, as it was fortunately given to me. But I do think it's something that anyone who is honestly trying to stay sober and to follow the AA program, whether it's the techniques for a long time and then just a little bit of the steps, is bound to find. I've heard people come into AA and say, well, I've been in a year or 2 years or 3 and I haven't found any spiritual basis. I haven't found any faith. And yet by their very words and by their acts that you see, you know that they are living a life based on faith when they didn't before. And you know that it has required faith to stay sober that long, if only faith in themselves and faith in the group. And that's enough to begin with. Very often those of us that have been in a long while are apt to talk more freely and more openly of God and of spiritual matters than people who have been in a short while. And possibly we may disturb people who are new or who are here for the first few times. I don't think they should be disturbed, because nobody's going to force them to move any faster than they can move. They will do their own moving, step by step, ahead, in the way that is right for them. No one of us could or should be able to hand our brand of AA complete and wrapped up in a package to anyone else. They've got to find their own, and they will find their own as they go along. They'll find their own because we have all kinds of techniques here that will help them, that will make them feel better, that will remove them from their pain and give them a chance to feel human again. And when people have felt human again for a while, 9 times out of 10 they feel great gratitude. And out of gratitude comes love. And out of love and gratitude comes faith. And that's what AA has come to mean to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty Man, very much. Before we close the meeting, I want to thank this group, Gilbert, for inviting me here as leader and to make it so delightful to have 2 such capable speakers. These 2 people have certainly helped me, and I take it for granted they've helped a lot of us. And just reminding, I'm not speaking for the newcomers, just for one, talk of the old-timers, those that have been in some years. It is very necessary that we remind ourselves that if we're up now, we want to stay up, and we can do it on our own. I love what you said about faith. I know a lot of us don't like to face that word. But I like to throw the other side of it, and that is, when people talk about fear, fear, my friends, is faith in reverse. That's all. And now we will close the meeting in the regular way by repeating the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. kingdom.